So, remember the game Concord, or maybe you don't, because it was so forgettable that it barely made a splash. But despite its obscurity, Concord is now infamous for being one of the biggest financial disasters in gaming history. We're not talking about just another flop, we're talking $400 million down the drain. Yes, you heard that right, Sony blew through $400 million on a game that lasted only 2 weeks before being completely canned. This isn't just a misfire, it's an absolute train wreck, and the story behind it is as insane as the numbers themselves. I wasn't planning on talking about Concord because, let's be real, nobody cares about this game anymore, but after a former developer from the project came out and spilled some serious tea I couldn't resist, what I learned was jaw-dropping, not just because of the colossal financial hit, but because of how Sony managed to let this happen under their watch. It's a perfect storm of corporate arrogance, toxic positivity, and straight-up denial, and it cost Sony big time. Let's start from the beginning. Concord was in development for 8 years. 8 long years of grinding away, trying to create what was supposed to be Sony's next big hit, a hero shooter that would compete with the likes of Overwatch. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. From the very start, the project was plagued with issues, mismanagement, and an inability to stick to a coherent vision. Now, before we get deep into this, I don't usually talk about this kind of stuff, especially not about online or multiplayer games, because I don't play them. I am a single player gamer, and that's what I do on this channel. But the reason for making this video is because Sony and PlayStation are known because of their great single player games, Uncharted, The Last of Us, God of War. So basically I want to talk about how big of a mistake Sony made by focusing on this stuff. Now let's get started. For those of you unfamiliar with game development, 8 years is an eternity, especially for a genre that's as fast-moving as hero shooters. When Overwatch launched, it was an instant hit, defining the genre and setting a high bar. Meanwhile, Concord was still stuck in the oven, unable to even decide what kind of game it wanted to be. By the time 2023 rolled around, Concord had finally hit alpha, a stage where the game is playable but far from finished. And let me tell you, when Sony got their hands on it, they must have been horrified. After 8 years and $200 million already spent, the game was in such bad shape that Sony had to throw another $200 million at it just to get it to a minimum viable product stage. That's developer speak for barely good enough to sell. Let that sink in. $400 million on a game that wasn't even functional when it hit alpha? What the hell were they doing for 8 years? To put this into perspective, Concord is now officially Sony's biggest financial loss on a game ever. We've seen big budget titles come and go, but none of them come close to this level of disaster. The Last of Us Part 2 cost around $220 million to make. Spider-Man 3 is projected to cost about $350 million. Both of those games are juggernauts, flagship titles that define entire console generations. But Concord? A game that no one even knew about until it failed. That cost $400 million. Let's break that down a bit more. $400 million is the kind of budget that could produce multiple AAA games, not just one. Sony could have made at least 3 or 4 solid titles with that kind of money, but instead they poured it all into this black hole of a project. And for what? A game that lasted 2 weeks before being pulled from every storefront and refunded to the handful of people who actually bought it. I mean, it's not every day you see a game get canceled just 2 weeks after launch. We're talking about a game that had so little going for it that Sony decided it was better to kill it completely than to try and salvage anything from the wreckage. Here's where things get even more ridiculous. Internally, Concord was hyped up as the future of PlayStation. That's right, Sony believed this game was going to be their next big franchise. They were talking about Concord like it was going to be the next Star Wars, a cultural touchstone that would define a generation. And that kind of blind optimism is exactly what led to its downfall. In the early stages of development, Sony gave the studio behind Concord free rein. They handed over the keys and said, go make something great, but instead of sticking to a clear vision or focusing on creating a solid game, the development team got lost in a sea of ambition. They were aiming for the stars, trying to create a sprawling, interconnected universe with cross-media tie-ins, all while forgetting to actually make a good game. And this isn't just a speculation. Someone who worked on the game told that Concord was being touted internally as a Star Wars level project. Sony had such high hopes for this game that they were already planning TV shows, comics, and other media to expand the Concord universe. They were banking on this game being a massive hit, the kind of thing that would carry the PlayStation brand into the future, but none of that mattered because at its core, Concord was a mess. Hey, what's up guys? Today's video is sponsored by 13Z, a new hack and slash roguelike action adventure game from Mixed Realms, the studio behind Sorrento VR and Gordian Quest. If you're into fast-paced combat and epic boss battles, you'll want to check this one out. So 13Z puts you in the shoes of a warrior trying to become the 13th member of the legendary Zodiac Guardians. You'll battle through monster-filled stages, face off against the Guardians in intense boss fights, and of course get stronger after each fall. It's all about refining your skills, unlocking new characters, and creating synergies with different abilities as you progress. Right now, 13Z has just launched its first global playtest on Steam, and they're looking for feedback. This version of the game is still evolving, so keep in mind it's not the final product yet, but it's already got some serious potential. If you want to be part of the early playtest, hit up the Steam page through the link in the description below and get in on the action. There's also a bunch of cool stuff planned for future updates, like more characters, a multiplayer mode, and even a vibrant village that grows with your progress. Trust me, if you're into games like Hades or Risk of Rain 2, you'll feel right at home with 13Z. Big thanks to 13Z for sponsoring today's video. I'll leave all the info you need down below, so go check it out and let me know what you think once you've had a chance to dive in. One of the main reasons Concord failed so spectacular was the development culture surrounding it. According to my source, the team behind the game was trapped in what's called toxic positivity. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, toxic positivity is when a workplace becomes so focused on maintaining a positive, upbeat attitude that any form of criticism is seen as negative and unhelpful. It's like putting blinders on and pretending everything's fine, even when the house is burning down around you. In the case of Concord, this toxic positivity prevented anyone from speaking up about the game's issues. Nobody could point out that the game was a disaster in the making because they didn't want to be seen as a downer or a troublemaker. And without honest feedback, the project just kept barreling toward disaster. This isn't just a Concord problem though. We're seeing more and more of this in the gaming industry. Studios are so scared of criticism, both internal and external, that they create these echo chambers where everything is great and nothing needs fixing. And then when the game finally comes out and flops, everyone acts surprised. It's like the Cyberpunk 2077 fiasco all over again, but even worse. At least with Cyberpunk, the team eventually admitted their mistakes and started fixing things post-launch. With Concord, they didn't even get that far. The game was dead on arrival, and Sony was forced to pull the plug before it could do any more damage. Another reason Concord went off the rails is that a significant chunk of the development was outsourced. After Sony realized the game was in a terrible state, they had no choice but to bring in outside studios to help finish it. But here's the thing, outsourcing isn't cheap. When you bring in another studio to fix your problems, you're paying a premium for their time and expertise. And when you're already $200 million deep into development, adding another $200 million just to get the game to a shippable state is a recipe for disaster. No, let me be clear, this isn't uncommon in game development. Outsourcing happens all the time, especially when a project is running behind schedule. But in the case of Concord, it was clear that the original team was so far off course that they couldn't even finish the game themselves. And that's how you end up with a game that costs $400 million but still feels like a half-baked, unfinished product. What makes this even more frustrating is that all of this could have been avoided. If Sony had stepped in earlier, if they had pulled back on the reins and refocused the development team, they might have been able to salvage something. But instead, they kept pouring money into the project, hoping that eventually things would turn around. When Concord finally launched, it was immediately clear that something was wrong. The game was a buggy, unplayable mess, and the reviews were brutal. Within days, Sony started issuing refunds to the handful of players who had actually bought the game. It wasn't long before the game was pulled from every platform: PlayStation, Steam, Epic Games, you name it. Concord was gone. And that's not even the craziest part. Despite the massive budget, despite the years of development, despite the marketing push, Concord only managed to make about $1 million in gross revenue. Not net revenue, that's gross. That means before accounting for any costs, the game made about $0 0.25% of its development budget back. That's insane. You could probably make more money selling lemonade on a street corner than Concord did in its 2 weeks of existence. It's one of the most catastrophic financial failures in gaming history, and it's hard to imagine how Sony let it get this far. But here's where things get even crazier. Sony wasn't just banking on Concord being a hit in the gaming world, they were already planning out a whole cross-media empire around it. They were working on an Amazon Prime series, comics, and other content to build out the Concord universe. Think about that for a second. They couldn't even get the game right, but they were already planning out TV shows based on it. It's like they put the cart so far ahead of the horse that the horse didn't even know there was a cart. Sony was so confident that Concord would be a success that they started developing spin-off content before the game was even finished. This is the kind of overconfidence that kills projects. They were so busy planning for the future that they forgot to make sure the game actually worked. And now all of that cross-media content is in limbo. The Amazon series, probably dead. The comics, never happening. All of the hype and ambition that Sony had for Concord has gone up in smoke, along with $400 million. So where does Sony go from here? You'd think they'd learn from this massive failure, but if history is anything to go by, they probably won't. There are already rumors that other first and second party games in development at Sony are even more expensive than Concord. That's right, Sony is currently working on games that could potentially cost more than $400 million to make. If they don't change course, we could be looking at another disaster on the horizon. Because here's the thing, the gaming industry is in a weird place right now. Development costs are skyrocketing, but the quality of games isn't necessarily improving. We've seen big budget games flop left and right because they're rushed to market, they're underdeveloped, or they're simply not what players want. The failure of Concord isn't just a Sony problem, it's an industry problem. Game development has become so bloated, so expensive, that studios are struggling to keep up. We're seeing more and more games that are overhyped and underdeveloped, and players are getting fed up, and a lot of it comes down to the way games are developed these days. Studios are so focused on creating the next big franchise, the next Star Wars or Marvel Cinematic Universe, that they forget to actually make a good game. They're obsessed with building these sprawling universes with cross-media tie-ins, but they're not putting the time and effort into making sure the core product, the game itself, is worth playing. This obsession with building franchises before the game is even finished is killing the industry. We're seeing it more and more, not just in gaming, but in movies, TV, and other forms of entertainment. Studios are so focused on what's next that they're forgetting to focus on what's now. Another major issue in modern gaming, which Concord perfectly encapsulates, is the culture of overpromising and underdelivering. How many times have we seen a game get hyped up as the next big thing, only for it to flop because it couldn't live up to the expectations? No Man's Sky was one of the most notorious examples, but at least they managed to turn it around with updates over time. Concord, on the other hand, didn't even get that chance. Sony went all in on the marketing for Concord. They hyped it up internally as the future of PlayStation and convinced themselves that it was going to be the next Overwatch or Fortnite. But in reality, the game never stood a chance. The development was so mismanaged, the game was so broken, that it was doomed from the start. And the worst part is that this kind of overpromising is becoming the norm in the industry. Studios are constantly trying to outdo each other with bigger, more ambitious projects, but they're not taking the time to actually deliver a polished, playable game, and when those games inevitably flop, the studios are left scrambling to pick up the pieces. If there's any silver lining to the Concord disaster, it's that it might serve as a wake-up call for the industry. $400 million is a lot of money to lose, even for a company like Sony, and if they don't start rethinking how they approach game development, we're going to see more and more flops like this. Like, come on man, let's be real for a second. How hard is it to give gamers what they want? People have been asking for Days Gone 2 for so long now, but Sony doesn't seem to give a fuck about it. It's so frustrating. Studios need to stop chasing trends and start focusing on making good games again. The obsession with creating the next big franchise, the next cross-media empire, is killing creativity in the industry. Instead of trying to build the next Star Wars or Marvel Cinematic Universe, studios should be focusing on making games that are fun, engaging, and polished, because at the end of the day, that's what players want. They don't care about the potential for a TV show or comic book spin-off. They want a game that works, a game that's worth their time and money. And until studios start delivering on that front, we're going to keep seeing disasters like Concord. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Simple Concord is a perfect example of everything that's wrong with modern game development. It's a case study in mismanagement, overhyping, and toxic positivity. Sony poured $400 million into a game that was doomed from the start, and they have nothing to show for it. Hopefully this serves as a wake-up call for the industry, because if studios don't start learning from these mistakes, we're going to keep seeing more flops, more wasted money, and more disappointed players. The industry needs to change, and it needs to change fast. Let's hope Concord is the last disaster of its kind, but something tells me it won't be. Well, so that was all for this video. I really hope this kind of shit comes to a stop in gaming industry and we get good old story-driven single-player games from Sony again. I will see you in the next video. Have a good day.
The most exciting thing we can do in a